Rishi Sunak, obviously, is going to become, later this morning, the country's first Asian and first Hindu Prime Minister.
So the news of his victory came during Diwali, the Festival of Lights, celebrated by millions of Hindus and Sikhs as well, and has been hailed as a historic moment. And we're joined by Sundar Kumar of the British Future think tank, which focuses a lot and talks about a lot, identity and race, and by former Culture Minister Ed Vaizey. Good to see both of you this morning. Let's start with you, shall we? How significant was it, do you think, that we have, or is it, that we have a Hindu Prime Minister now?
I think it's an enormously significant moment of social history. I think most people won't focus on the ethnicity or the faith of the Prime Minister because they think the fair thing to do is to not make too much of it, and that's exactly the right principle. But this wouldn't have been possible 10 or 20 years ago at all. For somebody like my dad or his generation, he came to this country in 1968 as a doctor from India. He thinks it's a remarkable thing to see because, you know, for several decades, when Rishi Sunak was born, there wasn't a single Indian or Asian or black member of the House of Commons.
Yes, which was only, I mean, not your father's generation, but only 1980. I mean, that feels like relevant recent history to people of my age, where he was part of a party and leading a party that didn't, as you say, have a single black person in it.
And we're used to it now. We've got ethnic minority chancellors, home secretaries every few months because they change so often. But that's incredibly new because there hadn't been a British Asian MP in the cabinet until 2014 when Sajid Javid went into the cabinet. So this is normal. We're all used to it now, but it's an incredibly new and positive development.
Well, let's drill into that. What's changed then? You're absolutely right. We wouldn't be having this conversation 10 years ago. It simply wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have been on the landscape. So what's happened to us as a country? What's changed in that decade?
Two things happened. One is that the British-born children of the first generation of migrants had more opportunities in professional and public life and took them. But the other thing that's important is there was a lot of ethnic diversity in the Labour Party for the first, in the 80s and 90s. David Cameron came in and he said, my party is going to be part of that. I'm going to bring about a change. And so I think he sped up in 5 or 10 years something that would have happened in 15 or 20.
It's interesting, isn't it, Ed, that here we are always having to force ourselves to have this conversation because it doesn't sort of really come naturally, because actually when we talk about the new Prime Minister, we think about his policies, we think about what he's said, we think about his PR gaffes and some of his PR triumphs. We don't think about his ethnicity. We have to make ourselves think about it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. I think we are a very diverse country and I think everyone is very comfortable with that. And I think that Rishi Sunak's heritage and ethnic background is secondary to the fact that we're pleased to have a Prime Minister who appears to be able to do joined-up handwriting, know what he's doing, has a plan for the country, whether it works or not, will at least introduce efficient and competent government. And that's all the things that most people sitting at home thinking about their mortgages and the cost of living crisis will be thinking. But it is, as Sundar says, a remarkable transformation, at least in the public face of our society. It's a transformation that's been happening over the last 20 or 30 years, and I don't think we should miss the opportunity to drive forward more inclusion and more diversity in lots of other areas of our country's life.
No, well, that's a good point. I mean, it's a strange thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, no violins, because he's put himself in this position. However, the honeymoon period seems remarkably short now, not least, of course, because normally political commentators and newspapers and all of those things wait a while because normally a new Prime Minister arrives after a general election. So there is at least the sense that the country has voted for it. Liz Truss had a few days and then the Queen's passing changed everything. It barely had a second. And after that huge, long leadership debate, then some days, 40-odd days, sort of thinking, well, I've lost and I'm out of it. Suddenly, after 92 hours, where he spoke to a lot of MPs but didn't speak a word to the country, he's there and looking, I have to say, rather dazed about it.
Yeah, he did.
And we're all a little bit like, OK, he's in. Anybody any idea what he's going to do?
Yeah.
And what he's really about? I mean, you know him, you're pleased he's in. What is he going to do?
Well, I mean, I thought his speech yesterday was absolutely terrible. It's not the real Rishi Sunak. He's got to kind of relax and have a conversational style. There's a wonderful clip of him.
Was that because he was terrified? Was that because he was surprised? As you say, he's very polished and he wasn't even looking at the right camera.
Yeah, they wrote a speech for him at the last minute, which he basically read out, which was a huge mistake. And if I was in the room with Rishi Sunak, which I won't be, I would be just saying, you know, just jot down some notes and speak from the heart. There's a great clip that I saw on Twitter yesterday, actually, during the leadership debates against Liz Truss, where he's taking on someone who he disagrees with. And it's passionate. And it reminded me of Tony Blair. I mean, whatever you think of Tony Blair as Prime Minister, he had a wonderful ability to connect and talk human to the public. And Rishi Sunak needs to discover that. He's going to be fighting a huge battle. I mean, the honeymoon ended... I was watching Kevin Maguire earlier. The honeymoon ended with Kevin Maguire, as it were. You can see what the left attack is going to be, this out-of-touch, hugely rich man imposing austerity.
Let's address that, because you have a different view about that. There will be people... I mean, Penny Mordaunt, in her bid, which she nearly made, and possibly because of that will be, you know, in the Cabinet. We'll talk about who might be in a moment. But... What do you make of his wealth? Because she made a big thing of the fact that she knows about having to count pennies. Yeah. He definitely doesn't. So is that an asset? Because you feel actually it is.
Well, I think it's an asset. I mean, I said glibly a few months ago that he was incorruptible. I didn't want to give the impression that every other politician is corruptible because they're not wealthy, but at least you know, I think, that he will be taking decisions in the public interest. He's not...
Well, he will be choosing to do,
exactly.
I guess is your argument, something because he believes in it and wants to do it, not because he's looking to make a fast buck. Is that the argument?
And he's not worried about, you know, when Rishi Sunak leaves office, we won't be worried about his £115,000 prime ministerial allowance or whatever. So I think, you know, just as we were talking about his heritage should be irrelevant in terms of his competence as a prime minister, the fact that he is wealthy should be irrelevant. I personally do not enjoy the fact when politicians kind of go out of their way to try and pretend that they come from humble backgrounds. There was the famous moment in the leadership election after Margaret Thatcher when Douglas Hurd, old Etonian, pretty posh, you know, went around saying, my father was a tenant farmer, I know what it's like. Just all I crave, and I think all we crave at the moment after the chaos of the last few months, is somebody who at least knows what they're doing.
Look, just before we talk about Cabinet, I want to bring Branda in here, before we leave the ethnicity thing. What's your view on it?
Well, I think it's quite a complicated picture because I'm working class and he clearly isn't. So I think class is a bigger issue in this country about diversity now, I think. But a public representation is massively important. In fact, my son, who's 10... I'm furious because I wanted him to be the first Asian Prime Minister, as all Indian mothers would. But it was really... I said, does it matter to you? And he was like, oh, it's nice to know that it can happen. But, of course, he's seen Obama as well. So he's growing up in a very different world to the one that we grew up in, Sunder. But it's interesting because Yasmin Alabai-Brown in The Independent this morning has written a really interesting piece that says British Asians should not blindly support one of their own. And she then talks about cutting the £20 of the universal credit at the same time as having a really expensive swimming pool for his own kids being built at the same time.
Yes.
And I think that is going to become a bit of an issue for him.
I'd like
to makes his policies.
His dad was a GP, wasn't he? And his mum was
a pharmacist.
Yeah. So I know that's not, you know, struggling, because GP is a well-paid, you know, strong profession that you're glad if your children can do. But it's also perhaps not... It's not the wealth of his... Of his in-laws. Of his in-laws,
no.
Yeah,
and
so
I think
he has got a bit of that
And I think what he really does exemplify, and his parents don't do, is the absolute aspiration of those economic migrants who came over in the 60s by invitation of the British government, who needed people to work in all their industries here. And actually... You know, my family tried to send me to a private school for primary school. My sister was a nurse. You know, my dad, they couldn't really afford it, but they were desperate to try and put me in that
place of opportunity.
And that's what I think that I resonate with him in terms of, in that obviously he did it fantastically successfully.
Well, let's bring Sunak back in. Do you think that there's the possibility that British Asians, who are not naturally Conservative voting, might actually be drawn into the Conservative fold as a matter of sort of ethnic support and ethnic loyalty?
Not as a matter of ethnic support and ethnic loyalty, but actually Asians, black people in this country, they want all the parties to compete for them. You're not very powerful if one party thinks you're in the bag and the other party thinks you're out of reach. But did old people vote for Jeremy Corbyn because he was a 70-year-old? No, they didn't. Theresa May actually did. Theresa May did better with men and worse with women than David Cameron did. So the Conservative Party, by changing its face, they're laying some of the ghosts of Enoch Powell, of Norman Tebbit, but actually they haven't made the progress that David Cameron hoped
to come in on the money side of it. I could see you, couldn't you? What was your point on that?
Well, I think he will say, as David Cameron would have said as well, that he knows that not everybody in Britain has had the advantages that he's got, whether you're white, black or Asian. He has to acknowledge that. So this doesn't prove that Britain's a meritocracy. It proves that our elites are more open by your gender, by your faith or by your ethnicity if you've got the right educational and professional credentials. So we've made progress on that front. bridging the social class divide into politics is a much bigger deal. And I think if he can say that he recognises that Britain's more open, but actually you've got to extend that opportunity. I think an awareness of that really matters.
One sentence replies, please, because we're out of time. Penny Mordaunt is probably going to give her a job. What do you think? What role?
Foreign Secretary.
I was going to say that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the big jobs, like Foreign Secretary. Yeah, maybe.
I mean, she's made no secret that she wants it, has she? So maybe that will be one way to bring everybody together and do what Liz Truss didn't do.